I was just thinking, similar to a Shakespeare play, we have 5 acts. And you do know that in the 5th act of most Shakespeare plays, people either die, or they get exiled, or they disappear altogether, like Lear's fool, and you never know what happened to him. Or they get married. For me, this symposium is a marriage of minds. I give to you Act 5, Graham Harman, Aristotle with a twist.
In several publications, I have made the case for objects as the central theme of philosophy. It might seem paradoxical that Heidegger is cited as a key inspiration for this proposal, since object is almost never a positive term in Heidegger's philosophy, where it refers to the one-sided objectification of things, reduced to presence at hand for consciousness, or manipulable stockpiles of material for the enframing work of technology. In the later Heidegger, we find the word thing, a more positive term for the individual entity as it mirrors the fourfold play of earth, sky, gods, and mortals. Additional alternate terms might be considered. Bruno Latour prefers to speak of actors or actants. Ian Bogost employs the term units, with the Latin etymology, whose Greek equivalent monads in Leibniz is another candidate term. There's also the more traditional word substance, which I've sometimes used myself, less for shock value than to show the classical roots of the theme of object-oriented philosophy. Though all terminology is somewhat arbitrary, it should not be chosen carelessly. While it is tempting to coin neologisms in order to avoid being confused for someone else, it is often possible to retain traditional terms while cleanly removing their now irrelevant connotations. The reason I prefer the term object is simply because of its roots in the tradition of phenomenology. Husserl tells us openly in the Logical Investigations that experience is made of object-giving acts, and Heidegger's thing is an attempt to modify and amplify the famous Husserlian battle cry to the things themselves. When speaking of objects, in what follows I refer not only to objects as something objectified in consciousness, though these certainly exist and must be accounted for, but also to objects as described in Heidegger's tool analysis, incommensurable with any form of presence before the mind. Nor do I mean objects as opposed to subjects. Much recent philosophy wants to safeguard the special status of human beings, and worries that speaking of objects means risking human freedom and dignity and reducing everyone to slabs of objective physical matter of the same order as plastic, silicon, and wood. At the same time, such reduction is precisely what many other philosophers want to achieve, by showing that the reportedly special kingdom of the mind is governed by laws no different from that of physical nature as conceived by the natural sciences. Ultimately, I sympathize with neither of these groups. The concept of objects as physical objects is too reductive in spirit and succeeds only by asserting that non-physical or large-scale objects, such as armies, cities, and mythical archetypes, are mere folk concepts, fit to be eliminated in favor of some deeper stratum of the real. On the other hand, the concept of human subjects as a special rift in the fabric of the cosmos is equally unsatisfying, since the obvious fact that human thought seems to be more fascinating and complicated than the movement of rocks and electrons does not entail the unjustified claim that this difference is so important that it must be built into the very foundation of philosophy in the form of a radical dualism between human and world, any more than the fascinating distinction between things that burn and things that melt deserves a place in the very foundations of metaphysics. The situation is not improved if we add that human and world always come as a pair, such that we cannot think world without human or human without world, but only a primordial correlation or rapport between the two. This view, which still feels dominant in the continental philosophy of our time, was named correlationism by Campanella in his 2006 book After Finitude. The critique of correlationism became the sole common program of the authors grouped under the name of speculative realism, who disagreed about almost everything else. To summarize, objects are not just images or phenomena present at hand in human consciousness, although these are objects too, and must form part of the theory. Objects are also not to be identified with traditional substances or monads or with Latour's actors, nor are objects part of a permanent correlation or marriage between objects and the human subjects. What is normally called the subject is just a special form of object, I hold. And here we must add that object is not restricted to physical material objects moving through time and space as the root to which all else must be reduced. Object-oriented philosophy is not a materialism, since materialism ignores the partially mysterious character of objects, replaces them with an easily masterable theory about what they are, and then uses this theory to debunk everything in sight. In some circles, this is called enlightenment, using a very narrow theory of objects as material particles to demolish the gullible beliefs of less enlightened alchemists, astrologers, and Christians. And finally, objects are not simply the trailing valet of the human subject, doing nothing more than resist our wishes. Objects are not part of a human world correlate, since human beings are also objects in the sense I mean, and what people call world is not a single resistant lump, but is made up of trillions of dueling objects. And furthermore, all these human and inhuman objects interact according to one set of laws, just as Galileo insisted that the difference between celestial and terrestrial physics must be suspended. So much for negative remarks about what objects are not. What they positively are will be sketched briefly during this talk, even though the only proper name in the title is Aristotle. The present moment is one when no philosopher seems less futuristic than Aristotle. Everyone knows he was important once, and to some extent even now, but it seems inconceivable that he might eventually return as a figure of the cutting edge. Instead, Aristotle seems like the grandfather of a decrepit tradition of medieval scholasticism blown sky-high by the moderns, and even the tone of his writing strikes many as dull, middle-aged, and oppressive. I will try to make a better case for Aristotle than this, showing that he is well positioned to address a key fault line in present-day continental philosophy. Two important roots for the philosophy of objects can be found in Husserl and Heidegger, and while these familiar figures have begun to seem like respectable but aged uncles for our discipline, my view is that they have not yet been fully digested and assimilated by more recent developments. In Husserl's case, the role of objects is clear, since he uses the term himself when speaking of intentional objects. Against the empiricist model of bundles of qualities, which treats horse and apple as code words for bundles of palpable impressions in no need of an underlying object, Husserl is a staunch defender of objects that precede their qualities, and he is surely the first idealist to do so. When we rotate pears and wine glasses on a table, we encounter different profiles or adumbrations of them at different moments. When we circle city walls and construction sites, we view them from every different angles. The intentional object is not attained by adding up all the different profiles, but is already there from the start, imbuing each of the profiles with its characteristic style. As Husserl says it, we encounter our friend Hans as a unit, not as a set of loosely related Hans images linked together by family resemblance. Intentional objects do not hide. They are never withdrawn or concealed. They are simply encrusted with extraneous sensual data that takes much work to strip away in order to reach their more austere underlying essence. Any hiding and concealing of objects is found not in Husserl but in Heidegger. Against the view that to the things themselves means to the things themselves as they appear in consciousness, as Husserl has it, Heidegger famously argued that what is characteristic of objects or things is precisely that they do not appear as present in consciousness, which occurs only in such infrequent cases as malfunctioning equipment, theoretical comportment, or perception. Unlike Husserl's intentional objects, Heidegger's tool beings are hidden and concealed. Generally, we do not realize that they are there until something happens that makes us aware of them. They are withdrawn into subterranean darkness, deeper than any possible presence to us. They cannot be accessed directly, but only through gradual and imperfect unveiling, or as I prefer, through indirect illusion. Husserl's objects cannot withdraw from the sphere of consciousness because there isn't anywhere else for them to go. By contrast, Heidegger's objects can only withdraw from consciousness into subterranean depths because by definition they are the surplus that resist all possible presence, guaranteeing some residue or reserve behind any possible configuration before the mind. These two concepts of object are very different, yet what they share in common is that both intentional and real objects are units irreducible to any sum total of qualities, and equally irreducible to their sum total of pieces. While only Heidegger allows objects to be hidden, withdrawn, or concealed, Husserl would also agree that objects cannot be replaced by a specific set of qualities present to the mind right now, since the object is always a unit deeper than any of its transient incarnations in any given moment. And though only Husserl forbids us to undercut phenomena by grounding them in a subphenomenal sphere, both would agree that we get nowhere by breaking up genuine units into tinier material or other pieces. Even for Heidegger, what withdraws from view during efficient construction work is a hammer, not the quarks and electrons of which the phenomenal hammer is made. It's a substantial form of a hammer, I would argue. In short, both Husserl and Heidegger give us philosophies basically devoted to the integrity of individual things, despite their two very different concepts of the object. And this is what links them most closely with the tradition of Aristotelian philosophy, despite their numerous other differences from it. Against all pre-Socratic attempts to pulverize everyday things and turn them into deeper underlying elements, and against the efforts of Plato to replace individual things by universal forms, it was Aristotle who defended the role of primary substances or individuals in the world. And here we must consider a distinction between the undermining of objects and what I have called by analogy the overmining of objects, which was referred to briefly today in another paper. If individual objects are rejected as the first principle of philosophy, this can only be for one of two basic reasons. Objects will be treated either as too shallow or as too deep. There's also a third case in which objects are treated with mixed messages as too shallow and too deep simultaneously. Each of these three kinds has numerous subvariants, but all are united in attacking the supposed naivete of a philosophy of individuals, and all score most of their points by whipping, slapping, and beating objects to a pulp. Let's begin as Western philosophy began, by treating objects as too shallow to be the truth. In this way, objects are undermined, subverted from beneath by a supposedly more fundamental layer of the cosmos. This is the dominant theme of pre-Socratic philosophy, which is of course also the first physics of the West. Whereas common sense lives in a world of horses, donkeys, vegetables, and trees, the pre-Socratics undercut these objects in two different basic ways. One is to find the most primitive physical element to which all objects can be reduced. Whether it be air, water, fire, atoms, or air, earth, fire, and water mixed by love and hate, the everyday objects of the world are shown to be too large and bulky to be fundamental. Instead, they must be made of some finer root stuff. The other way is to treat the cosmos as a single underlying lump from which all differentiation emerges. This is the famous aperon, and the main disagreement is over whether it exists right now without our realizing it, that's being in Parmenides, will exist in the future after the work of justice is done, that's Anaximander, or existed in the past before it was shattered to pieces, whether through spinning very rapidly as for Anaxagoras, or through inhaling void and breaking the aperon into many tiny pieces, that's Pythagoras. While it is tempting to view the pre-Socratics as quaint or romantic figures belonging to a long-dead era of simplistic theories, we should note in passing that these theories are alive and well today. Mainstream materialism still thinks that everyday objects are fully reducible either to quarks and electrons, to something even more basic than these, or at least to some underlying mathematical structure, as in the structural realists, as they're called. And the theory of the aperon is alive and well in the recent philosophies of the pre-individual, which cannot succeed since the pre-individual is either one or more than one, and if one only, then it's a lump. And if more than one, we already have a theory of objects. The problem with these undermining theories is their tendency to treat all layers higher than the most basic as nullities existing only for doxa, or opinion, only for some observer in terms of some outward effects, not as anything in their own right. Real horses and trees are supposed to be replaced by appearances or by horse effects and tree events. But this badly understates the autonomy of things from their own pieces. Even if we are radical materialists who scoff at any notion of a human soul, the human body has numerous aspects that do not belong to the individual tiny elements of which it is composed. Various atoms of someone's body can be replaced without becoming a different body. An object can also have retroactive effects on its own pieces, as is especially easy to see in the case of the humans. I can decide to remove a tooth or some other inessential organ for medical reasons, and the body in that case changes only accidentally. Finally, we can choose to add new parts with various piercings or physical implants, and the range of options here is likely to increase beyond belief by century's end. It is purely arbitrary to say that all of these descriptions of higher layers of the cosmos might be eliminated in favor of a description of tiny physical movements or hypotheses about mathematical structure. If we look at Plato's philosophy, we find the opposite movements, which can be designated with the new term overmining, by analogy with the existing English word undermining. According to overminers, as I call them, the reason reality is not made up of individual things is because it is made up of forms or universals capable of inhering in many different things and graspable in principle by the minds. But there are even more obvious examples of overmining that have nothing to do with Plato. The more obvious examples are cases such as idealism, where the object is nothing more than its appearance to some human or divine minds, or relationism, where the object is nothing more than its sum total of effects on all other things here and now, or social constructionism, where the object is nothing more than the way it is coded by a given social structure, or even correlationism, that weaker form of idealism, where there is always a world to accompany the mind, but where that world does nothing more than resist humans, without having any internal life or structure of its own. Or empiricism, for which there are no objects, just bundles of qualities, with objects being nothing more than arbitrarily posited, useless chunks, in which all these directly encounterable qualities are supposed to inhere. According to all these overmining philosophies, the object is a gratuitous fiction, a meaningless X posited beneath a world of human access that's the only thing to which we have direct access. The problem with overmining philosophies is that they cannot explain why anything would ever change. If things are nothing more than what they are right now, if they are entirely expressed in their current state in the world, and if this holds for absolutely everything, then there is no reason why anything would ever shift from one state to another. For change to occur, there must be something held in reserve, an excess to the things behind their current interactions with all other things beyond their current state of being shaped by society, language, or the minds. If undermining philosophies tend to be realist in spirits, due to their commitment to some deeper layer of the world, overmining philosophies tend to be anti-realist in tone, since they hate the notion of any cryptic or hidden layer beneath what is purely accessible to the mind, or at least immanent in the world. The only way overmining philosophies can escape this difficulty while still resisting the philosophy of objects, I believe, is to take an especially radical overmining stance like that of Meillassoux, and say that things are able to change without any hidden dimension due to the principle of absolute contingency, namely that anything can happen at any moment without any reason at all. In this way, the principle of sufficient reason is abolished, a terribly high price for a philosophy to pay, whatever its fascinating results. Against this theory, it will be necessary to defend the principle of sufficient reason against Meillassoux' fascinating critique, but that is a subject for another time. There are also philosophies that overmine and undermine simultaneously. In fact, I believe the two are inherently parasitic on one another. and this is simply more explicit in some cases than in others. One of the explicit cases is materialism. For on the one hand, materialism seems to be a textbook example of a philosophy which holds that everyday objects are not deep enough to be the truth. If you actually believe in the existence of bananas, cities, and mines, or so the story goes, then you're a fool, for each of these supposed things is a mere surface effect of tiny emotions. But notice that when we finally arrive at the ultimate basis of the cosmos according to these theories, we end up instead with an overmining theory. For whether our final layer of the universe is water, an atom, a quark, a string, or a mathematical structure, in all these cases, this miniature little alpha factor turns out to be something no different from a bundle of tangible properties that can be known about it. It will be said that an atom is nothing over and above all the true facts about atoms. There is no cryptic withdrawal of the being of the atom behind all positive facts, since this belief would be typical of an unscientific attitude. In short, materialism turns inevitably into a form of idealism, replacing the permanent mystery of things with some dogmatic set of traits allowed to replace it. That's one example of a philosophy that overmines and undermines at the same time. Another would be when process philosophies are placed in a single package with philosophies of relation. For on the one hand, the appeal to process suggests that individual objects are petrified constructions of the mind compared with the dynamic flux and flow of the cosmos, an infinitely creative lava lamp or kaleidoscope, compared with which all individual objects are nothing but rigid, middle-aged bores. It's not a horse, it's a dynamic process from which horse images sometimes emerge for certain observers, or horse events occur like lightning flashes, and so forth. This is the undermining side of such theories. But on the other hand, the simultaneous appeal to relation treats objects not as too shallow, but as too deep. Things are nothing more than their sum total of current impacts on other things. There's nothing hidden in a thing since it is fully deployed in the world and things mutually define one another, and so forth. And this is the overmining side of such theories. Incidentally, it should be said in passing that Latour and even Whitehead are not really process philosophers, despite Whitehead's constant use of that term. After all, both philosophers are pure overminers, thinkers of extreme concreteness, so concrete that things cannot endure even the least change in their relations and remain the same thing. In fact, I have argued that both are radical philosophers of cinematic instance that simply happen to pass away very quickly, and in my opinion, this makes them highly inappropriate partners for Bergson and Deleuze, who are pure underminers when it comes to the notion of individual instance or individual things. So I oppose the tendency to lump all four of these together into one group. Materialism and combined process relational philosophy are just two of the more glaring examples of simultaneous overmining and undermining. But in nearly every case, a philosophy dominated by one of these attitudes needs to call on the other as a supplement. The simplest example can be found in Parmenides, who, after denying all motion and all plurality, at least needs to admit that it seems like there are many things in motion, and thus he has to make room for doxa or opinion, which deals only with surfaces. In this way, individual things are skipped over, lying midway between being and opinion, but abandoned, and therefore lack any autonomous existence of their own. Another example would be in all those philosophies of language or the subject, which, as if horrified by the prospect of slipping into outright idealism, posit some sort of formless matter as a reservoir beneath formatted actuality, but without allowing this matter to do much of anything but resist humans, and without letting it have any internal duels among its own pieces. The most difficult thing to do is to think between these two extremes. It is necessary to conceive of objects as not fully reducible downward to their constituent pieces, and also as not fully reducible upward to their relations or impacts on the mind or on other things. Objects must be conceived as autonomous individuals, not entirely disconnected from their opponents or from the other things against which they bitterly or happily strike, yet also as sealed off from one another. The first figure in Western philosophy to avoid the downward spiral into raw physical elements or lumps, and the upward spiral into intelligible ideas higher than individual things, was Aristotle. There was much in his theory of substance that we can no longer accept today, but wherever the individual thing reasserts itself in philosophy across the centuries, there are generally Aristotelian roots to this tendency. When choosing the title of this lecture, that is what I meant. Our future path cannot be that of some new variant of undermining or overmining philosophies, but only with a subtler and more unusual approach to objects, and this needs further explanation. Early in his controversial book on Deleuze, Alain Badiou tells us that our epoch can be said to have been stamped and signed in philosophy by the return of the question of being. This is why it is dominated by Heidegger. Assuming that we agree with this statement, and I do, though for reasons differing from Badiou's own, it follows that the way out of our epoch is to digest Heidegger fully, so as to ensure that any apparent steps forward are not just lateral steps that fail to assimilate what he added permanently to philosophy. It seems perfectly true to say that the return of the question of being is what Heidegger gave us, since this theme obviously dominates Being and Time, his major book. But this return is not just a return, however rooted it may be in ancient Greek thinking, since the question of being is asked in a new way. And neither does Heidegger just pose the question and leave it open. There is a perfectly good provisional answer to the meaning of being in Time and Sight. This is a point that Gadamer seems to grasp better than anyone else. When midway through Truth and Method, he gives us the following outstanding summary of Heidegger's philosophy. One short paragraph. What being is was to be determined from within the horizon of time. Thus the structure of temporality appeared as ontologically definitive of subjectivity. But it was more than that. Heidegger's thesis was that being itself is time. This burst asunder the whole subjectivism of modern philosophy, and in fact, as was soon to appear, the whole horizon of questions asked by metaphysics, which tended to define being as what is present. Gadamer's realist conception of Heidegger, as reflected in this passage, is the correct one, in my opinion. The frequent idea that Heidegger and being in time is asking about the transcendental conditions of any possible posing of the question of being, the Kantian version, is misleading. Time in the Heideggerian sense is less a structure of human Dasein than of being itself, and what we can say about being itself is that it is never reducible to any form of presence. Being withdraws from presence. It is the excess that makes all overmining philosophies impossible. There is a strong nucleus of reality in Heidegger, despite his apparent obsession with the correlate of Dasein and Sein, or human being, and Heidegger cannot be assimilated, let alone surpassed, by any new philosophy that downplays this deeply realist core of being in time. We first need to clear our minds of the usual connotations of time as connected with change or movement, since that is not how Heidegger uses the term. Whereas for Bergson it is simply impossible to treat time as made up of cinematic frames or instants, Heidegger's point is completely different. Namely, for Heidegger, even within any cinematic frame or instant, there would be an ambiguous threefold structure undercutting any sheer presence. We could say that for Bergson, the static instant is impossible for lateral reasons, since there is a movement that cannot be recomposed of isolated instants in the first place. For Heidegger, by contrast, the static instant is impossible for vertical reasons, namely because an instant is always more than what it seems to be, even if it were frozen and never passed away at all. Time for Heidegger is simply the ambiguous interplay of withdrawal and clearing and the presencing composed of these two extremes. This is due not to categories of Dasein's existence, but to the structure of being itself. This point is best grasped in the famous Tool analysis of 1919, first published 8 years later in Being in Time. Since I have often made the case elsewhere, we can pass briefly in review through the topic of Tool being in Heidegger. An effort is made by Heidegger to radicalize phenomenology, which holds that to the things themselves means to the phenomena themselves, since only the phenomena are directly given, and any notion of a subphenomenal world is at best a mediated theory that must first be grounded in the phenomena present to consciousness. Heidegger's famous counterclaim is that only rarely are things present to consciousness. For the most part, they withdraw into subterranean invisible effectiveness, appearing to view only when they malfunction or go awry in some fashion. This is often read as saying that all explicit theory emerges from tacit background practices. Given this interpretation, it is no wonder that some people claim that John Dewey already gave us Heidegger's philosophy 30 years ahead of time. And Richard Rorty, for instance, claims that the main thing Heidegger added to Dewey's vision was just a few thousand pages of history of philosophy that we never find in Dewey. But Heidegger goes quite a bit further than this. For one thing, the difference in question cannot be a difference between theory and praxis, because if theory falsely objectifies the things by turning them into caricatures of their deeper, withdrawn realities, the same is equally true of praxis. Lavoisier in his chemical laboratory objectifies hydrogen and oxygen by means of his theory, reducing them to a series of distinct properties. But Lavoisier's practical relation to his beakers, alembics, desk, and chair is no more intimate than his relation with hydrogen and oxygen themselves. His practical relations with these latter things distorts them no less than his theory distorts the chemicals. In other words, reducing things to present and hand properties is not a unique fault belonging only to the brain and the eye, but is also performed by Lavoisier's hands as they move the equipment. Any human contact with things is doomed never to drain them to the dregs, never to exhaust the subterranean darkness and plenitude of their full reality. This is what temporality in Heidegger means, after all. We cannot gain direct access to the things themselves, as Husserl aspired to do, because the things themselves simply cannot be made present, cannot be accessed outside any context of interpretation and use, and this holds for practical activity just as it does for the most heroic theoretical comportments. But now we need to take an additional step that Heidegger's deeply Kantian presuppositions never allowed him to take, though Whitehead could have taken it for him. It is not humans whose limitations cause reality to withdraw, as though being were there for the taking, if only Dasein were not cursed by a joint theoretical and practical original sin that forbade us from returning to the Eden of being ever again. Nor can we merely share the blame with other species by adding smart dolphins, monkeys, and crows to a longer list of conscious entities cursed by the withdrawal of being. The withdrawal of reality from presence is not a special privilege or curse belonging to a limited class of entities with full-blown consciousness. Instead, it is relationality per se that is responsible for the falsity of presence. No entity ever makes full contact with another, whether conscious or not. Here I have often used the favorite example of medieval Islamic philosophy, fire-burning cotton. While human Dasein cannot fully grasp the depths of withdrawn cotton being, and while untheoretical cotton planters also fail to exhaust it through the mere act of harvest, it cannot even be said that the fire makes contact with all aspects of the cotton. The fact that the fire has the power to destroy the cotton is irrelevant. Humans have a similar power to shred and disperse it. Destructive power is not enough to give humans full contact with this entity, and neither does it give fire that sort of power. The key difference in Heideggerian philosophy turns out not to be Sein and Dasein, but being and relation. Being is that which exists in excess of all relational effect on or contact with anything else. These relations do occur, they simply do not exhaust the being of things. One last point about Heidegger. It is clear that his Sein, by acting as a dark subterranean residue eluding all access, is a challenge to all overmining philosophies, which hold that what you see is what you get, or that the world is nothing but a plane of self-affecting immanent reality. But the claim could still be made that Heidegger is an underminer of objects. There's plenty of textual evidence for Heidegger regarding his being not only as withdrawn, but also as singular rather than plural, as something like a pre-Socratic aperon or unified molten plasma devoid of any contact or conflict between specific beings, so that individual entities would be an illusion of the same order as the illusion of presence. And true enough, Heidegger does have this side. Even in his later meditations on the thing, from 1949 onward, one aspect of the fourfold is a unified earth. Meanwhile, the case for a unified being is made quite explicitly by one of the most talented and original of his admirers in the 1940s, Levinas, who speaks of a unified Ilia, or there is, broken into pieces only by human consciousness. But without going into detail, I would make the counterclaim that Heidegger shows several flashes of awareness that the realm deeper than presence is made of things, though admittedly it is only in the later work that we hear many explicit statements about the relations between jugs and wine, bridges and shores, and other pairs of things that should be able to interact despite the lack of a human witness. The point remains ambiguous in Heidegger, though in the end we need not follow Heidegger's interpretation of Heidegger any more than we need to follow Einstein's interpretation of Einstein. There is a very different conception of individual objects in Husserl, as mentioned earlier, but since it will be less relevant to the present discussion than Heidegger's objects, it can be summarized even more briefly. Husserl's world is absolutely riddled with objects, even if they are not real objects withdrawn from all presence. On the contrary, these so-called intentional objects are nothing if not present. That's the whole point of phenomenology, is to confine oneself to what is present to the mind. For phenomenology, we exist at each moment in a world of triangles, blackbirds, citrus fruit, chairs, mailboxes, and even centaurs and unicorns. These objects present themselves to the senses of the mind, yielding constantly different facets, surfaces, adumbrations, yet these objects are not hidden from us behind all these shifting and flickering qualities. If Heidegger's blackbird is always more than our relations with it, Husserl's blackbird is always less than our relations with it. The bird is there for us, even if it is hallucinated, fully present from the very first moment we expend our energy in taking account of it. But for us it is never simply an austere bird object capable of various stances, actions, and appearances at different moments. Rather, we always encounter the bird overdetermined as sitting at a specific distance from us in a certain direction, either silent or chirping or tweeting, either flying or sitting or falling from the sky. But all of this is simply bonus experience of the object. It does not hide or conceal the bird from us, since the bird is already there in our experience from the start, no matter what the bird is doing. It is accidental and superfluous, and can be stripped away by analysis to help us clarify things, but does not obstruct our experience of the bird itself. How different this is from Heidegger, for whom bird being forever withdraws into a dusky underworld inaccessible to all direct access. Returning now to Heidegger, once it is seen that objects withdraw from all relation, there is a genuine problem with knowing how objects can affect one another at all. That they do so seems clear enough, but the fact that reality somehow solves the problem for us does not mean that philosophers have the right to call it a pseudo-problem or a fait accompli. Quite the contrary, our primary task is to explain how things happen that seem to have no obvious reasons for happening or capacity to happen. Given that objects withdraw from all relation, and this cannot only be partial, for since objects are unified rather than glued together out of parts, contact is all or nothing, how is it that objects relate anyway? As I've written elsewhere, this problem was raised above all by Islamic theology, which first gave the answer that objects do not affect one another, since only God affects them. Occasionalism is the famous name by which this theory is known. This problem later flared up in Europe for philosophical rather than theological reasons, and initially concerned only the apparent difficulty of different kinds of substances interacting with one another, extension and mind, though it was quickly rebroadened by Descartes' successors into a more general theory in which body-body interactions become problematic again, just as they had been among the Ash'arites of Basra and those influenced by their traditions, such as Al-Ghazali. Occasionalism is often mocked today, but only for the reason that almost all talk about God is now mocked by philosophers. But the problem with occasionalism is not that God is involved, but that any specific entity is involved at all. No one entity or kind of entity should be given the special power to engage in direct causal interaction when others cannot. In fact, I've made the same complaint about the upside-down occasionalism of human Kant, in which human habit or mind is treated as the only locus of interaction. And I would make exactly the same complaint about any theory of a unified world lump or quasi-lump whose unity is said to allow for mutual influence between things unable to do it to each other directly, insofar as the lump is viewed as both heterogeneous and continuous. As I've written elsewhere in Principal Networks, one of the best things about Bruno Latour's philosophy is his secular occasionalism, in which all entities are forced to do the causal work themselves, despite great difficulty, without easy recourse to the monopolistic god of the Asherites, Malebranche, or even Whitehead. In the Islamic tradition, the occasionalism of the Asherites was generally opposed by the rationalist Neoplatonic and Aristotelian tradition, represented by such familiar names as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes. But in some ways it is remarkable that Aristotle never found his way to the occasionalist problem. Devoted as he was to the autonomy of individual substances, he never seems to have found any difficulty with one entity exerting influence directly on another. He is right to have avoided any notion of a central mighty causal agent. There is a prime mover in Aristotle's metaphysics, of course, but this prime mover is simply a first and most powerful mover, not one who intervenes in the burning of cotton balls or the falling of every hair from our heads, unlike the omnipotent and omniscient god of the occasionalist, or even the less extreme Thomistic god who sustains the world without suspending causal power for all other entities. Nonetheless, Aristotle does brush against the interesting question of how absolutely withdrawn objects could ever exert influence on one another, and it is worth taking a brief look at how he does so. Now that all the contemporary setup has occurred, we can turn to our hero, Aristotle. Let's turn briefly to the metaphysics. It is safe to say that Aristotle is not one of the most fashionable classic philosophers in recent continental thoughts, no matter how many passing mentions he may receive. A good dispute can be had as to how Aristotelian Heidegger really is. In my view, the relation has been tackled incorrectly, but the point can certainly be disputed. What is much clearer is that Aristotle plays no especially important role in the Deleuzian counter-history of philosophy, nor do Badiou or Zizek make a special use of Aristotle, to say nothing of his rude handling in Derrida's White Mythology essay. But once we start to look at individual things as the central topic of philosophy, Aristotle's dominant position throughout the history of philosophy is hard to overlook. It is safe to say that in the metaphysics, Aristotle's first concern is to protect primary substances or individual things from what I have called undermining and overmining attacks. In the former case, the danger for him is also the pre-Socratics, for as we have seen, they reduce things downward either to a one or to some multiple of physical elements. Unlike Heidegger's mere reverential treatment of these earliest Western thinkers, Aristotle is often quite harsh in his witticisms about them, comparing the pre-Socratics to lisping youngsters who are just learning how to speak, to amateur boxers who land nothing but lucky punches, and even to household slaves and livestock who act at random without foresight. The problem with all these philosophers Aristotle holds is their obsession with the material cause. They cannot explain why matter changes, and forget that a statue is stony, not just stone, and that a house is wooden, but not just wood. It is true that Anaxagoras also introduces nous or mind as a cause, but Aristotle follows the imprisoned Socrates into Phaedo in complaining that Anaxagoras makes use of this mind only as a last resort whenever recourse to material causes fails. He also notes that those who make one or more physical elements the first principle have difficulty with non-physical things, which also exist. As for philosophies of being or the one, Aristotle does not see how the many could ever arise from such a principle, since according to Parmenides, all that is other than being is not. In short, individual things cannot be undermined either with a monolithic being or with some physical element, and though I might give different reasons for why this is so, Aristotle's rejection of it is perfectly sound. But there's another sort of claim rejected by Aristotle as undermining, and this is a point where we must eventually disagree with him. An individual thing for Aristotle turns out to be an individual form as opposed to a common universal, and since the form must be one, it cannot be made of active independent parts, but only of potential ones. For instance, the bones, joints, and flesh of a human are only material components, not formal parts. What divides into parts is the composite whole made of form and matter, not the substance or thinghood of the thing. As Aristotle puts it, in relatively rare agreements with a pre-Platonic thinker, if an independent thing is one, it will not be made of independent things present in it in that way, which Democritus says correctly, for he says it is impossible for one to come to be out of two or two out of one. Aristotle admits that this leads to an aporia, an impasse, one that is later noticed by Leibniz. If the form is purely one, then how can a thing have parts? And how can things be different from one another? Retain this thought, since we will return to it shortly. Aristotle is equally critical of what I've called the overmining approaches to individual thinghood. His chief opponent here is obviously his own teacher Plato, whose theory of forms is criticized as a rival doctrine throughout the metaphysics, despite Aristotle's occasional expressions of regrets for having to criticize a friend. Among other difficulties, Plato never really explains how the individual things would participate in the forms. Furthermore, each individual would have to be made up of a wild menagerie of often partially redundant forms. Socrates, for example, would have to participate simultaneously in the forms of animal, human being, and two-footed, among many others. If the forms are separate from the things, it seems difficult to see how they can make up the substance or thinghood of things. Instead, Aristotle holds that the form must be in the substance of the individual thing, and in fact must constitute it. In short, he holds that there are no forms in Plato's sense. And this leads to a surprisingly Heideggerian moment in Aristotle, though he does not press the point. Universals, such as Plato's forms, cannot be the substance of things, since this substance is always individual, while the universal is shared by many things. Thus, an individual thing cannot be built out of universals. And moreover, universals are indestructible, whereas individual things are in most cases utterly destructible. In fact, Aristotle was the first Western philosopher to believe in a destructible primary substance, a bold venture for which he receives too little credits. These incommensurabilities between things and universals, coupled with the fact that knowledge is always knowledge of universals rather than of particulars, leads Aristotle to the really rather astonishing claim that no form can be defined. As he puts it with his underrated but odd sense of humor, for example, if someone were to define you, he would say a skinny, pale animal, or something else that would also belong to some other thing. In short, there is a radical gap between the individual things that are the primary substance of philosophy and any attempt to grasp them with the logos. Individuals are deeper than anything we can see or say about them. But there is another important form of overmining that Aristotle rejects, and that comes in his well-known attack on the Megarians in Chapter 3 of Metaphysics Theta. The Megarians hold that a thing is nothing more than it is right now, with nothing held in reserve. A house builder is only a house builder while actually building a house. Aristotle counterattacks with his famous theory of the potency in things, giving individual things an unexpressed excess or residue not found in their actuality here and now. And finally, there's another passage in which Aristotle anticipates a critique of overmining that is also found in Husserl and even in Saul Kripke. There's a conference about Kripke in this building today. This happens when Aristotle rejects those who define the sun by such phrases as going around the earth or hidden at night. For if these features change or turn out to be false, and of course going around the earth has turned out to be a false trait of the sun, we would not conclude if it does not go around the earth, then it cannot be the sun. But rather, we have discovered that we were wrong. The sun does not really go around the earth. In this way, the individual thing is deeper than its apparent attributes, even very important ones, even if it's not deeper than its real attributes. And certainly the thing is deeper than its accidents. We cannot define a dog, for example, by the exact position of its legs and ears at a given moment, since these are accidental and can change rapidly without the underlying dog having changed. Most of these objections work as well now as they ever did, as do some others that Aristotle never needed to dream up. But there is one that I think we do not need to accept and really ought to reject. Namely, his assumption that the individual forms must be final layers of reality that can have parts only as parts of a material composite and cannot be made up of other forms. Here we see Aristotle's distrust, found later in magnified form in Leibniz, of the notion that composites or machines or aggregates could ever be individual things. By this view, a human can be a thing, but a family, team, conference, or army cannot. A tree can be a substance, but a forest cannot. And of course, in Leibniz, this becomes even funnier with a circle of men holding hands is not a substance. The Dutch East India Company is not a substance. A pair of diamonds glued together, my favorite, is not a substance. As though one individual diamond were a substance, given all the work that needs to be done to polish it and shape it. It's a strange distinction. If we allow for emergent entities to exist, such that the city of Chicago has qualities not possessed by its parts, is robust to constant changes in the residents and buildings within it, has retroactive effects on its parts, and is able to generate new parts, this is Manuel de Landa's list of criteria for an emergent assemblage, and I happen to like it, then Chicago is no less an individual thing than the individual police officers, cottonwood trees, and beetles found within the city limits. Nor is there any good reason to exclude elevated trains or the city's 5 major sports franchises from the list of individual things. The Chicago Cubs baseball team, no less than its players or the blades of grass on its playing field, is an autonomous reality not exhausted by its current effects on or relations with other entities in the vicinity. It is neither reducible downward to its human components nor reducible upward to its functional effects on the environment. The Cubs cannot be undermined or overmined, not that it helps them much. Aristotle's main worry with such a model seems to be the idea of an infinite regress. Those who defend an infinite regress, in his own words, abolish knowing, since it is not possible to know until one has come to what is indivisible. This is why he also takes care to state that none of the 4 causes can have an infinite regress. And he also links the infinite regress with the trollish sophistry of relativists who pretend to want reasons for absolutely everything, even though they act on the same obvious ultimate assumptions that the rest of us do. And I say trollish because this seems to me to be the basic behavior of the internet troll. Keep challenging everything, even if they don't really believe there's something to be challenged. Because one can critique something, one does it. In Aristotle's examples, these people do not choose to walk off cliffs, obviously, and they walk to Megara whenever they wish to go there rather than sitting motionless in one place. But Aristotle himself recognizes that there are many different kinds of infinity, of which it is important here to distinguish two in particular. One is the infinity of intermediate points between any two places, exploited so nicely in the paradoxes of Zeno, though also attacked by Aristotle in the Physics. In order to move from point A to point B, it is first necessary to go to point C midway between the two, then point D midway between points B and C, and so on ad infinitum. This is certainly contrary to reason, since we know that the motion occurs. But an infinite regress of substances is merely counter to common sense, not counter to reason. Once we recognize that some individual things are aggregates made up of smaller components, it is, in my opinion, a small step to realize that all things must be such aggregates. Though the converse does not hold, I would not say that all aggregates are things. Aristotle recognized this himself, in fact, when he admitted that it leads to an aporia if we hold that individuals cannot be made of other individuals, since this would mean that individuals have no parts and hence no distinct individual features. Kant is slightly more open on this question, holding in the antinomies merely that we cannot know whether there are simples or only an infinitely descending chain of composites. But if we follow the insight contained in Aristotle's aporia, while ignoring his needless fear of this infinite regress, we find that individual things must be divisible into subcomponents if they are to have distinct individuality at all, and this requires an infinite regress into the depths of things. But here again, the reverse does not hold. There need not be an infinite progress upwards into larger and larger entities, and finally into some world as a whole, since there is nothing forcing substances to enter into combination with other substances. Aristotle gives us a quantized world made up of individual chunks, at least in his theory of substance. He is aware that since none of these objects are made of universals, none of them can be defined, and this means that in a way they must withdraw from the power of language and thoughts, although he does not pursue this point at length in the way that Heidegger does. But I would claim that not only the human logos encounters things in terms of universals, instead, inanimate objects must do this to each other as well, even in Aristotelian terms. Fire encounters the flammable, not the individual concreteness of this cotton and this paper. And in that respect, cotton and fire withdraw from each other no less than they do from us. The first occasionalists in Iraq, more than a millennium after Aristotle, were forced to this insight for theological reasons, and it later found fertile soil in 17th century European philosophy. It has never really left us, bewitched as we still are in philosophy by gaps in the world of various kinds, or by all the various attempts to deny or bridge these gaps. The problem with Aristotle's model of a quantized world of individual autonomous things is that they ought to be closed off from all causal interaction entirely. In order to affect one another, they would have to meet in a continuum of some sort. The continuum, of course, is the great theme not of Aristotle's metaphysics, but of the physics. There we learn that time, magnitude, and motion are not atomistic, but continuous. But this solution cannot immediately work for the relation between substances in Aristotle, since substance is what is not continuous, but made of discrete individuals. This room has the potential to be divided into 1,000 or 1,000,000 spatial sectors, arbitrarily, and the elapsed time of this lecture can be split arbitrarily into 3, 15, or 75,000 parts. But the same does not hold for the number of people present in the room who are individuals of a certain determinate number, not a lump-like human continuum, ready to be arbitrarily carved into whatever number we please. For things to have mutual influence, they must not only reside in private vacuums of individual chunks, they must also be partially transformed into portions of a continuum without their individuality being treated as a mere surface product. How this might happen is a problem that Aristotle never solves, but one that he raises for us more urgently than expected.
Patricia Carr will now offer us a response to Graham's talk.
It's rare that I voluntarily describe myself as a sociologist, but I am. And when you receive a PhD in sociology, they make you commit to modernism, modernity. So along with a few early modernists, you now have a modernist. And if you would transgress at all in sociology, you're allowed to be a postmodernist. So maybe we have a touch of that too. I have been interested in and speculative realism, really for the present and the future that it might grow into. I'm imagining that it'll be a piece of a reconfiguring of science, physics perhaps, and mathematics and poetry, as I've indicated already. So I'm going to make I'm going to raise three questions that are maybe for Graham. I think Graham's answered some of them, and maybe for all of us, or that we might think about this intervention of and in philosophical discourse. One, when I was invited to respond to Graham Harman at a conference on medievalism several months ago by Eileen, I did not think of Aristotle. My first thoughts were of Graham's work on Bruno Latour, who has claimed that we have never been modern. So perhaps we are medieval, I thought, endlessly circuiting from an age of darkness to Renaissance and Enlightenment. Although I had read Latour, Graham's reading of him was surprising and exciting. For me, a sociologist who has often needed to draw from my colleagues the fine line between social construction, discursive construction, psychic or unconscious construction, and finally deconstruction, Graham's Latour offers a way to be all but done with these, and yet to be deeply engaged with sociality. An engagement, however, that necessitates an ontological rebooting that restores the wonder of objects, that conceives a causality of allure, that offers a take on aesthetics, that inserts a refreshing aporia between ontology and epistemology, such that objects are allowed to be, regardless of our consciousness of them. While the necessity of turning to ontology already had made me a fan of Deleuze over many other critical theorists, Graham's Latour nonetheless shocked me, as it introduced me to a critique of correlationism, or a critique of the presumed impossibility of world without human knowing, or of a philosophy without the assumption of a primordial rapport between human and world. A critique already different, perhaps stronger than the one offered by Meillassoux, who had coined the term correlationism. Graham's stronger critique involved his read of Latour as a relationist. Against Latour's view, or Graham's view of Latour's view, that objects are constituted through relations with other objects, Graham emphasizes the objects are not reducible to their relations. No relation exhausts an object, it endures beyond its relations. What shocked, if not disturbed me, was that this was an ontology different than Deleuze, or even Whitehead, whose philosophy was often made compatible with Deleuze's uncritical theory, especially theories of affect, to which my work has been deeply indebted. While for Deleuze and Whitehead, relations are external to objects, that is, objects are not reduced to their relations, nonetheless, objects do not exist outside all relations, as Graham argues they must. Here, Deleuze's thought of virtuality and Whitehead's of eternal objects come under criticism as correlationists, in that in these philosophies, a world pre-existing us remains a world pre-existing us, but for us, as a world of potential, of virtuality, subsisting in pre-individuality or prehension that both overmines and undermines objects. Here, one can think of Aristotle, who, as we just heard, conceived the individuality of the object with a form that is not universal and therefore is withdrawn from the power of language and thought. But we might also wonder more about Aristotle's potentiality and how it differs from Deleuze's virtuality or Whitehead's prehension of eternal objects, or to put it plainly, what specifically is different about the dynamic of the fourfold object? This is my first question. 2. When first asked to respond to Graham after Latour, I thought of Max Weber, who before he wrote The Protestant Ethic had produced studies of the development of Roman land tenure and of medieval trading and law, presaging his later works, including The Protestant Ethic, which would examine economic life within the context of a geographically and historically specific culture as a whole. I thought of Max Weber because when I teach him, just before I teach Karl Marx, in a course on classical sociological theory, I give students a brief treatment of the Catholicism of feudalism, preparing them for those elliptical expressions in Weber that they cannot fill in about Thomas Aquinas or St. Paul or even Martin Luther or John Calvin. I ask them to think of feudalism as the background that supports the analyses that would be the foundation of modern Western sociology. And just as students come to think of feudalism as background to that great Protestant loneliness, that private, endless self-judging that motivates capitalist productivity, they are shocked by the sudden turn to Book 1 of Das Kapital. For there, in an introduction to a secular materialism, at the very start of the text are things, 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 or as Marx puts it, an immense accumulation of commodities that holds the secret of the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails. A warning, actually, in that first sentence, a warning that the commodity is only the phenomenal form of something contained in it, but distinguishable from it, as Marx puts it, pointing to the potential, the capacity that is labor power, an abstraction from use or utility, an abstraction that becomes a matter of perverse desire and pleasure, as relations between things become fetish, displacing relations between humans, and thus, in the capitalist mode of production, Marx adds sardonically, commodities abound in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. And if today, in what has been tagged an aesthetic capitalism, when the commodity is said to be designed to sensually transmit a creative juice that will be transformative for its user, think of cell phones, such that the aura and value of the commodity is its transmission of effective capacity, when the exchange seems to be a direct one of matter-energy, a circulation within what is awkwardly called the prosumer. The question is an object-oriented ontology, with its protection of the essence of the object, solid ground for a political economic critique of what has been described as the immeasurable value of effective labor power? This is my second question. Is the critique of materialism, attendant Graham's object-oriented ontology, unhealthy symptom of these times, or does it offer a radicalization of the object's ontology that requires a rethinking of Marxist treatment of the commodity? After all, Graham's critique of materialism as not realist but idealist in its presumption of underlying objective states of physical substance, a critique, it would seem, that refuses much of what is implied in Marx's separation of the mere phenomenal form of the commodity from the hidden inner thermodynamic workings of labor power, which is to be revealed, uncovered, so that truth be found, a truth that is meant to restore consciousness in the human mastery of nature and the object world, that has led to the idealization of work in Marxism, no less than in Protestantism. If we have never been modern, it is perhaps the case that we have never been secular, or better, realist either. 3. And would not an object-oriented ontology thus require rethinking fetish or perversion and their link, at least since Freud, to repetitious enactment of unconscious fantasy as opposed to reality? Without correlationism, Harman suggests that fantasy is as real as pencils, paper, angels, horses, cows, chairs. While Freud may have contributed to decentering consciousness with the insistent intrusion in body and mind of unconscious fantasy, psychoanalysis has not yet let us return to what before it might be called medieval, or what Eugene Thacker has recently called the horror of philosophy, a return to a whole bestiary of impossible life forms, but also demonology, occult philosophy, theology, mysticism, apothecaries for drugs and charms. Psychoanalysis has not yet been able to level the ontological ground for all objects, or to stay far enough away from cure through words, and an insistent return to consciousness and reality or normality that are not actually realist. And something in that has even prevented the more immediate possibility that object-oriented ontologies would seem to propose in a refurbishing of aesthetics as a first philosophy, in a recognition of allure as causality, as Graham puts it, where through sensuality or by proxy of the sensual, a real object touches a real object in the interior of some other entity, some third entity, and more, where methods or practices come to require a musicality of expression, a poetics of performance and presentation, which might very well be critique, a continuation of touching the real through sensual illusion. This is my third question. Does, or in what way, does object-oriented ontologies motivate a deep transformation of the disciplines and all authored styles of presentation, of being, doing, and knowing?
I can briefly answer these, I take it? Am I allowed to?
Yes.
Okay.
Don't be too brief.
Okay. First question was about the fourfold structure of objects. I'm going to do these in reverse order. But I like them. Second one was about politics. The third one was about fetishes. And the last one was about transformation of the disciplines. I'll go in reverse order. The number 4 is very easy. It's up to everybody else. There was this person last night who said that my talk was impoverished because I only talk about philosophy. Maybe, but people are coming to me with all these surprising ideas in their own fields based on my works, and it's always flattering and wonderful, and it's in fields that I know nothing about. So I learn from those. My job is just to do what I do best and see what happens. Let other people do the work in their own fields. And so I don't know what's going to happen. I would never have expected medievalists to be one of the main groups to pick up all this philosophy and do interesting things with it. We've had a fascinating series of papers today. I would never have expected artists to be one of the main groups to pick these things up. I got a letter from a guy in fishery science, and actually he's a vegetarian. I'm not sure I want to be contributed to fishery science, but I think he was doing history of fishery science, so I wasn't actually catching fish more using my fingers. So it's okay, it was kind of a Latorian Actor Network history of the fisheries. So that's what I would say about that. I'll leave it up to other people to show us what can be done with the theory. I'll try to do some other things myself besides this impoverished pure philosophy too, but I'm relying a lot on other people. As for fetishes, I think we actually have the first anti-fetishist theory of objects, because fetishes in psychoanalysis are inscribed in relation to something else. They're stand-ins for something else. Something with the mother usually. And that's not a healthy relation to objects. There's more to objects than mother. We do sometimes get accused of fetishizing these lists of objects. You quoted one.
Yeah.
Ian Bogost calls them Latour litanies, which is very funny, because Latour does these so well. He didn't start them. I actually just finished writing an article on Latour litanies for an anthology. And actually the guy loved the essay, but he rejected it in its current form because he said, I thought you had agreed to create a big beat poem at the end of a long litany. I had promised that. He wants me to just create this giant 3-page poem litany, so I'll have to do that before he accepts the article. It'll be fun. But this technique is simply necessary. It's not pretending to be an argument. It's simply a necessary rhetorical way of getting people to flatten out their world and looking at all things as equal. You see this in Homer's catalog of ships in Book 2 of the Iliad may be one of the first. Hesiod has litanies too, right? In Buddhist literature, there are all kinds of examples. I mentioned this at the New School. These wonderful things that begin by saying there were 50 Buddhas, 300 Bodhisattvas, 50,000 tigers, 400,000 war elephants, and then Buddha has to expand the universe for all of them to fit in, this kind of thing. You get them in, Francis Bacon in Book 2 of the Novum Organum, that wonderful section, Instances Agreeing in the Nature of Heats, where he lists every warm and hot thing in the world that he can think of. ranging from volcanoes to fresh cow manure to the sun. Everything there. Latour does these very nicely, and we do them too.
You have a few good ones too.
Yeah, I think to create this beat poem, I'm just going to go through my published works and extract the ones that are there and put them all in a row. So that's what I would say about fetishes. Case for politics, this is more interesting, and I don't have a politics to directly derive from my work, but there have been some interesting and sometimes hostile discussions on the internet in recent days about Marxism and triple O. I think Levi Bryant handled this pretty nicely over the last few days, both on the internet and here in New York. As Levi put it, what's the most famous commodity in Marx? It's the worker. Well, if the worker is totally defined by their relations, why would you ever have a revolution? There has to be something in the worker more than the commodity status. And I want to put in a plug here for Levi's new book, The Democracy of Objects, where I think the really interesting political moment in that book is his use of Niklas Luhmann to show that actually humans are not part of the political system, according to Levi. Humans are certain universals are extracted from us and feed into this political system. So our political task becomes how to perturb that system that we're not part of, but that's above us somehow. So yeah, I'll leave that there. What does the fourfold model add that's new? I can answer this pretty briefly too, surprisingly. First of all, there are two kinds of objects in my theory, and I'm not sure that this has ever been done before, because I think people have misread Husserl's object as being the same as Heidegger's. There's a history behind this. The history, as you may know, phenomenology's ancestor is Franz Brentano, the great Austrian philosopher who was Husserl's teacher, also Freud's teacher in Vienna, who's an underrated philosopher, who brought back the medieval concept of intentionality, and this is a key element of his philosophy. And the way Brentano defines this, of course, is intentionality means immanent objectivity. It means that there are objects in the mind that are not outside the mind, that we love something that's in the mind, we love an object that's in the mind, we wish for something in the mind. He doesn't really ever talk about the object outside the mind, and there's been this misunderstanding. A lot of philosophers today, especially analytic philosophers, use intentional object to mean an object outside of us that we're pointing at. No, that's not what it means, in Brentano and Husserl at least. It means something, an object inside the mind. Now, this left a problem for Brentano's students, which is we don't want to be idealists, so what's the relation to the outside world? And I'm running out of time?
No,
Okay.
no,
I thought
we're
you were...
just smiling.
Brentano had a very important Polish student named Kazimierz Twardowski. His contribution was to say that we have to create a doubling. There's an object outside the mind, and there's content inside the mind. So there's two layers. Now, there's a problem with this, which is that content inside the mind sounds like Hume. It sounds like a bundle of qualities. It's not a unified thing. The unity is outside of us. It's this unified object outside the mind, and inside the mind is just this group of qualities together. That's what's implied. And you can look at Twardowski, even though he was several years younger than Husserl, as Husserl's rival and nemesis among Brentano's other students. Husserl admired him, but is also pretty harsh about him in his letters. This younger student that he really admired and wanted to outdo. And the way Husserl transformed this is to say, well, there's an object and there's qualities, but they're both immanent in the mind. I mean, Husserlians sometimes say, no, there's no distinction between inside and outside the mind. Husserl is beyond the realism-idealism distinction. That's nonsense. Husserl is an idealist, period. But what Husserl contributes, I would say he's the first object-oriented idealist, because he's the first idealist. You know, in Berkeley, it's bundles of qualities too, right? You're not going to have a chair object that's different from its qualities for Berkeley or any other idealist. But for Husserl, you do. You have a mailbox. That's the object, and you go around the mailbox and see it from different sides and find new features in it. But those features added up are not the mailbox. The mailbox is a primary unit. Merleau-Ponty picks this up too. This keeps phenomenology going. That what's primary is the unified thing. Merleau-Ponty says the black ink of a pen and the black of a shirt are not the same color, even if they are exactly the same in terms of wavelength, right? Because somehow the color is defined by the underlying thing to which it belongs. It's like a satellite going around the planets. So Husserl really invented this idea of an he calls it an intentional object. I call it a sensual object for several reasons, one of which is that intentional has been misunderstood by all the ensuing tradition. So anyway, that's the first thing that's new, is I don't think Husserl's concept of the object in itself has been properly understood. It took a lot of work to see this. For years, I also thought Heidegger's and Husserl's were the same, and then finally, one day I simply realized Husserl's objects do not hide. Why do we all keep thinking that they don't hide? They're there. They're simply encrusted with all this extraneous sensual detail that we don't need. In fact, that's the whole point of phenomenology, is to subtract all this accidental stuff and try to get at the underlying essence of the things. That's why all these analyses are needed. All right, and then Heidegger's objects, I think, also have not been understood correctly. They've been understood as practical things that are being used before they're present. No, they're things that withdraw from all contact, including inanimate causal contact. So I'm taking both Husserl's and Heidegger's concepts of objects, reading them differently, and they've never been put into the same model before. And I also think this explains Heidegger's fourfold, which has been the most puzzling concept in his entire corpus. People generally confine themselves to paraphrase of this. If you ever read a book like Heidegger's Late Philosophy by whoever, there's a lot of these out there, they always just paraphrase. Earth means the, whatever Heidegger says, the blossoming and the blossoming of the flower and the dew from the sky. All these lists of poetic terms that never really get explained, they simply get paraphrased. If you put these, and I think I've made a pretty rigorous case for why this is Heidegger's fourfold. I don't think it takes much forcing. If you go back to his early lecture courses, you can see this is what he's getting at. He's getting at the difference between the thing and its qualities on the level of presence and the difference between the thing and its qualities on the level of absence. That's the fourfold. Now, what's the value of it? I think you can derive...
Especially for change.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one everyone's always asking you, you know?
Yep, and if you go to the quadruple object, which is one of my books published this summer from Zero, that little thin purple book, I try to diagram this, and I think it gives you a very useful model. I try to derive time, space, essence, and eidos from that structure. I try to show how those breakdowns give rise to aesthetic effects and causal effects and various things. There's a lot more work to be done. But I also like the fact that it provides a model like the sciences have. I think this is the really admirable thing about the sciences, not that they can reduce everything and tell us that all of our myths need to be exploded and we need to become enlightened. That's the boring part. The interesting part about science is they have these models that predict the existence of new particles. We'll talk about physics now.
Yeah.
Predict the existence of new particles, that they, certain things are missing. You have to do tests to see if they're really there. And what I like about this fourfold model is it has allowed me to predict a few new things and say, okay, what does this line mean? If these three lines mean this, and I think in many cases have pretty good success in trying to figure out what those things are. So that's what I try to do with the fourfold model. All right.
Okay, I just realized, now this means Harman's philosophy is not proscriptive, but predictive.
I just heard that too. I thought,
So anyway, that's my little joke.
but not in that way.
Right, no, I
Yeah,
know,
not
I
in
know.
that way.
Now, just because we're running a little bit over time and we have a reception to also go to, what I'd like to do now is let this sit with us through the reception, and Nicole is going to give some closing remarks, and then we're going to head upstairs to the fourth floor to room 4406 for a reception. So.
Okay, I promise to keep them short, not to keep you too long from the wine. I have a messy mass of previous inscriptions, writing, and more fresh notes that I will not be capable of synthesizing, I'm sure. But I see a very nice kind of elision or lacuna in these proceedings, possibly significant. The lack of discussion in the conference rather inspired to speculate objects in the mirror of medieval works, of the medieval origins of the concept and word object, precisely as a philosophical term. Is this an oversight, a structural failure of vision to bump into what it ought to see? Or is it a purer kind of non-event, the causeless not happening of something? Sometimes I get the feeling that what does not happen is inexplicably powerful, and an abyssically negative spontaneity ruling and seducing all existent things from its universal invisible domain. The issue might prove an interesting playground for thinking the objecthood of the inexistent, of what is not there, a good limit problem for any philosophy wanting to relate to reality as constituted by how it is. And a question that the medieval, as a zone where a saint recommends preaching to non-existent creatures, where philosophers theorize divine alteration of the past and mystics see non-being as an excess of being, is already answering. But I prefer not to go there, and I don't have time, of course, wishing that I could move or realize that I'm only moving like the guild navigator in Lynch's Dune. I did not say this, I am not here. Instead, I'll close the event by trying to open it to some avenues of understanding along which the medieval origination of object might lead the way. To find a start to these avenues, imagine a generic medieval intellectual. That is, someone infused with what Leclerc calls in his well-known book, the love of learning and the desire for God. Imagine him encountering contemporary object-orientedness. First, the bad news. There's no absolute knowledge, no arriving at the omnipresent center. Then good news, we really have figured out what everything is. Objects. Bad news, objects incommensurably withdraw, remain irreducible to relation, are never knowable in themselves, so no theosis or becoming God, no henosis, no union, no subject-object union, no incarnation in any real sense, even though it might actually be there, I'm not sure. No, I don't think we have eternal individuals or anything like that. Good news, it's because of the above that anything is happening at all, and so on. This is a brute caricature for sure. Maybe the fellow would find relief, like a good bloodletting, in the transmutation or demotion of his desire, reprising the tide from the desire to be everything to a desire and maybe a contentedness to just be with things. Perhaps he would despair. Perhaps he would think he was in paradise and be filled with intoxication at the thought that these objects are exactly like God and he's surrounded by God everywhere. And here the occasionalism may come in as a kind of buttress or flying buttress. But and perhaps he would object, and this is what I'm more interested in. Perhaps he would object and discover a new kind of truth in his understanding, through his own understanding of the word object. And this is what I want to try to imagine. I'm going to dispense with this sort of invented sketch of a dialogue because it's who's a generic medieval individual? They're too multiple and so forth, and so is object-orientedness. So I want to just briefly, in like 4 or 5 minutes, talk about the primary meanings of the word object, which we know comes from the verb. It's a substantive from the verb. This was discussed earlier, this verb-noun relation. Obiakere, to throw something before someone. So objectus has a verbal meaning, a casting before, a putting before, a lying before, a being interposed, that which presents itself, that which one hits up against. It is the philosophical sense is primarily the object of a power, typically a human power. So in that sense, it's a human world, sort of term of human world correlation. And objects in this sense are things that are things or appearances that are thrown over against subjecta, subjects who are thrown under the field of manifestness. And so the first thing that I would expect someone might say, well, this is a kind of meaning of object that object-oriented philosophy is throwing away, and it wants to talk things. But the sort of speculative game that I would want to play is how can we rehabilitate these ideas in a third zone, in an outdoors, beyond a human world, correlate. And this is this idea of the third, the logic of the third, has come up today frequently. And I think already Graham's invocation of theological correlationalism is a kind of apophatic move. In a sense, he needs to use the word God and then say, but it's not God. To need the name and then to erase it. So this third zone, which is the product of this imaginary conversation, is perhaps a neither God nor not God. It's not a great outdoors. I think it's a great indoors. If the Middle Ages is a very sort of machine of the indoors, right, of the Ptolemaic world, of the cosmic egg, we have to think the great indoors is living in the great outdoors and not just pointing to it from within the indoors, so to speak. So what are the meanings of these words? Object, first of all, signifies something appetitive. This is clear from Aristotle, from the De Anima. Object later by the medievals is used to translate in the plural ta antikaimena, those things which lie over against. So Aristotle doesn't have a word for object. This term is used especially in relation to, soul food. Food, as discussed in the De Anima, food as that which nourishes, but really which keeps a being going, keeps a being itself. So in this sense, the food is the object of the stomach. The object is something alterative to some kind of power. And I think we have gestures towards some kind of idea, particularly in metaphors of burrowing, the idea that in some sense, we're worms, we're actually moving through this other space. And I'll finish hopefully with a brief comment about the worm. But let's keep moving quickly. So the second meaning is that objects are obstacular. They are obstacles. And the context for this use of the term is related to Robert Grosseteste's discussion of the extromissive theory of vision, also in the context of Augustine's treatment of that, right? So objecta are precisely what you what you bump into. So it's where you are, when that happens, you're affected by, a power is affected by where it is not, right? So that's what this seeing is, right? The sensed is the impassible. And I really love the sort of scientific and theological repercussions of this. For Thierry of Chartres, only earth and water are truly visible, not fire or air. The eye cannot bump into fire or air, but it only sees their external, sort of effects. What is everywhere hinders nothing. So therefore, you can't see God because God lacks this obstacularity, and also comes in to resolve. And this is discussed in some way in Boethius, how God can perceive everything, but not disturb the freedom of the in itself, right? And so divine omniscience is not an obstacle, literally, for free will, right? Okay. This is good. I'm being quick. Third, object is argumentative. I'm drawing all of this from a really handy article by Lawrence Dewan called Objectum, Invention of a Word. This is the meaning of object that he thinks is not related to, object as objection, that he thinks is not related to the philosophical term object as the object of a power. The weird thing is that this is the meaning that is in circulation for 150 years before the other term. And he just dismisses it and says, well, it's an equivocal double, right? But it has nothing to do with it. And contextually, there was never any confusion about whether one was referring to discourse or the object of a power. But this is the one I think I find most compelling to reflect upon, both because of, as a way into the objecthood of philosophy, the being of argument, the sense that objects themselves are arguments, are discursive, and just to relate it to some themes that were discussed before, this problem about tension between telos and becoming. I think argumentation has a weird kind of telic becoming, but it's not a telos which necessarily achieves an end, right? It may be end-seeking, so it may be in the idea of a certain kind of argument or discursivity. We can have some sort of overcoming of this problem between telos and becoming. And for me, the formal version of that would be commentary. So Nietzsche famously says, all of our so-called consciousness is a commentary on an unknown but felt text. That is a text that is withdrawn. So, okay, it is time for some wine. But let me just conclude by reading a passage by Giorgio Agamben about objects, about the human, which I think is from his work Stanzas, which I consider sort of classic, de facto classic of speculative medievalism. And I think it's important because it articulates this idea of a third zone, which is sensed, which is neither subjective nor objective, but which is really there, right? He says things are not outside of us in measurable external space, like neutral objects, objecta. So he's aware of the etymology of use and exchange. Rather, they open to us, or they open us to, ci aprono, the original place solely from which the experience of measurable external space becomes possible. They are therefore held and comprehended from the outset in the topos utopos, the placeless place, or no-place place, in which our experience of being in the world is situated. The question, where is the thing, is inseparable from the question, where is the human? Like the fetish, like the toy, things are not properly anywhere, because their place is found on this side of objects, and beyond the human, in a zone that is no longer objective or subjective, neither personal nor impersonal, neither material nor immaterial, but where we find ourselves suddenly, improvisamente, so spontaneously, improvisingly, facing these apparently so simple unknowns, the human, the thing. Thank you.